June 14, 2024, Kyiv, Ukraine. That was the day the music died. Not in the poetic sense of Don McLean's elegy, but in the cold, hard reality of geopolitics. The Ukrainian government, backed by its Western patrons, had just signed a 10-year security agreement with the United States, followed by similar pacts with JA and the European Union. The language was, "This is not negotiable anymore. No more off-ramps. No more diplomatic wiggle room. No more face-saving exits." The war in Ukraine had officially been locked into a trajectory that leads only one place: direct confrontation with Russia. Now, if you've been following the mainstream narrative, you might think this is just another step in the noble defense of democracy against Russian aggression. The White House, the State Department, the major media outlets, they've all framed this as a necessary commitment to uphold the rules-based international order. And on the surface, the numbers seem to back them up. Over $175 billion in U.S. aid to Ukraine since 2022. NATO action to within a few hundred miles of Moscow. Russian forces pushed back from Kyiv, Kharkiv, Kherson. The Ukrainians, we're told, are fighting for their very existence, and the West is standing with them. But here's the problem with that: it's a house of cards built on half-truths, wishful thinking, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what this war is really about. Let me tell you what's actually happening. I've spent the better part of 4 decades studying war, first as a soldier, then as a scholar, and always as a realist. I've seen how empires overreach, how leaders miscalculate, and how wars that start with grand declarations of principle often end in disaster. And what's unfolding in Ukraine right now isn't just another conflict. It's the culmination of a decades-long strategy by Washington to maintain its global dominance at any cost. A strategy that is now colliding with the hard realities of power, geography, and history. The official story goes like Russia, under Putin, is an actionist power hellbent on reconstituting the Soviet Union. Ukraine is a sovereign democracy fighting for its survival. The West must support Kyiv until victory is achieved, whatever that means. The security agreements signed in June are just the latest step in this righteous crusade. The data seems to support Russia's economy is under sanctions, its military has taken heavy losses, and Ukraine, with enough Western aid, can eventually prevail. But the data doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, it tells a very different one. First, let's talk about the battlefield. The much-hyped Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 failed spectacularly. Not because the Ukrainians didn't fight bravely, but because the West grossly underestimated Russian military adaptation. The Russians learned from their early mistakes. They dug in, built layered defenses, and turned the war into a grinding attritional slog. Meanwhile, Ukraine's manpower is dwindling. Western intelligence estimates suggest Kyiv is losing between 700 and 1,000 soldiers per day in some sectors. That's unsustainable. And yet, the Biden administration keeps pushing for more aid, more weapons, more escalation. Then there's the economic angle. The West assumed sanctions would cripple Russia. They didn't. Moscow pivoted to Asia, strengthened ties with China, India, and the global South, and actually saw its economy grow in 2023. Meanwhile, Europe is paying the price: skyrocketing energy costs, deindustrialization, and a growing sense that Brussels has been played for a fool. The US, of course, benefits from this. European dependence on American LNG has never been higher. But at what cost? Here's where it gets interesting. The security agreements signed in June weren't just about Ukraine. They were a message to Russia, to China, to the world. The message was: we're all in. No retreat. No surrender. But here's the thing about messages, and they're only as strong as the will to back them up. And right now, the West's will is wavering. Let's talk about the hidden motivations. Why is the US so committed to this war? Is it really about democracy? Or is it about something far more cynical: maintaining American hegemony in Europe, weakening Russia as a strategic competitor, and ensuring that NATO remains the dominant security architecture on the continent? Because if you look at the history, that's exactly what this is about. Since the end of the Cold War, the US has pursued a strategy of liberal hegemony, extending NATO eastward, encircling Russia, and preventing the rise of any peer competitor. The war in Ukraine is the logical endpoint of that strategy. It's not about Ukraine's sovereignty. It's about ensuring that Russia never regains its status as a great power. And if that means fighting to the last Ukrainian, well, that's a price Washington seems willing to pay. But here's the Russia isn't Iraq. It isn't Libya. It's a nuclear-armed state with a population of 140 million, a vast territory, and a military that, despite its early blunders, has proven far more resilient than anyone in the West expected. And yet, the hawks in Washington and Brussels keep pushing for escalation. They talk about decisive victory as if it's just a matter of sending more HIMARS or F-16s. They ignore the fact that Russia has already mobilized its economy for war, that it's outproducing the West in artillery shells, and that it's not going to back down. Now, let me be I'm not defending Putin. I'm not saying Russia's invasion was justified. But I am saying that the West's approach to this war is dangerously naive. We're sleepwalking into a direct conflict with a nuclear power, and we're doing it without a clear endgame. Because here's the Ukraine cannot win this war. Not in the way the West defines victory. The best-case scenario is a frozen conflict, a new Iron Curtain, and decades of instability on Europe's eastern flank. The worst-case scenario? A direct NATO-Russia war that could escalate into a nuclear exchange. And yet, the Biden administration keeps doubling down. Why? Because domestic politics demands it. The 2024 election is looming, and no president wants to be seen as weak on Russia. The military-industrial complex is making a fortune off this war. And the foreign policy establishment, what I call the blob, has staked its entire reputation on the idea that Ukraine can and must win. But what if they're wrong? What if this isn't just a war for Ukraine's survival, but a proxy conflict in a much larger struggle, the decline of American unipolarity and the rise of a multipolar world? Because that's exactly what's happening. The US is trying to hold on to its global dominance, but the rest of the world isn't playing along. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. The global south is refusing to pick sides. And Europe? Europe is waking up to the fact that it's been dragged into a war that serves American interests, not its own. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. And the West's insistence on non-negotiable outcomes is a recipe for disaster. So what should we do instead? First, we need to accept reality. Ukraine cannot be restored to its 1991 borders. Russia isn't going to collapse. And the longer this war drags on, the worse it gets for everyone. Second, we need to start thinking about diplomacy not as a dirty word, but as the only way to prevent a wider war. That means engaging with Russia, not isolating it. It means recognizing that spheres of influence still matter in geopolitics. And it means accepting that the US can't dictate the terms of the international order forever. This is controversial, I know. The blob will call it appeasement. The hawks will scream betrayal. But here's the alternative is far worse. A direct NATO-Russia war would be catastrophic. And the longer we pretend that victory is just around the corner, the closer we get to that abyss. I've been warning about this for years. I've seen how wars start, how they escalate, and how they end. And I can tell you the path we're on leads only to ruin. It's time to change course. Before it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't the first time we've seen this pattern. The blob has a long history of doubling down on failed strategies, not because they work, but because admitting failure would threaten the careers and reputations of those who championed them in the first place. Take Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers, declassified in 1971, revealed that the Johnson administration knew by 1965 that the war was unwinnable. But they kept escalating anyway, because no one wanted to be the first to say, "We can't do this." Sound familiar? The same dynamic is playing out in Ukraine today. The difference is that this time, the stakes are even higher, because we're not just talking about a regional conflict, we're talking about a potential collision between nuclear powers. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. foreign policy establishment has spent the last 3 decades operating under the assumption that military power alone can shape the world in our image. But that assumption was always flawed. It ignored the fact that other nations have their own interests, their own histories, and their own visions for the future. Russia, for instance, has never accepted the post-Cold War order as it was imposed on them. The action of NATO eastward, despite verbal assurances to Gorbachev in 1990 that it wouldn't happen, was always going to provoke a reaction. And yet, when that reaction came in 2014 with Crimea, and then in 2022 with the full-scale invasion, the blob acted as if it were caught completely off guard. How is that possible? How can an entire class of experts, with access to the best intelligence in the world, be so consistently wrong about something so predictable? Here's the uncomfortable: they weren't wrong. They were lying. Not necessarily in the sense of a grand conspiracy, but in the way that bureaucracies lie to themselves. The blob has a vested interest in maintaining the illusion of American omnipotence. Admitting that Russia has legitimate security concerns, or that Ukraine might not be able to win, would mean admitting that the entire post-Cold War strategy was built on a foundation of sand. And that's a truth too dangerous for the establishment to confront. So instead, they double down. They demand more weapons, more sanctions, more escalation, anything to avoid the humiliation of admitting that the world has changed, and we didn't see it coming. Take the recent revelations about the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. The official narrative is that we don't know who did it, but the evidence, circumstantial though it may be, points overwhelmingly to the US and its allies. Seymour Hersh's reporting, based on intelligence sources, suggests that the Biden administration ordered the attack in a bid to cut off Europe's energy lifeline to Russia. If true, this wasn't just an act of economic warfare, it was an act of geopolitical sabotage, designed to ensure that Europe had no choice but to follow America's lead. And yet, when asked about it, the White House dismisses the idea as utterly false. No investigation, no accountability, just flat denial. Why? Because if the truth came out, it would expose the fact that the US is not just a bystander in this war, it's an active partisan, willing to burn down the global economy to maintain its dominance. Now, you might, if the US is so determined to win, why isn't it doing more? Why not send troops? Why not enforce a no-fly zone? The answer is because we can't. The American military is stretched thin. Our industrial base is a shadow of what it was during the Cold War. And most importantly, our adversaries Russia, China, Iran have spent the last 2 decades preparing for this exact scenario. They've developed hypersonic missiles, advanced air defenses, and cyber capabilities that can neutralize many of our traditional advantages. The blob knows this, but they can't admit it, because doing so would mean admitting that the era of unchallenged American hegemony is over. So instead, they cling to the fiction that if we just send a few more HIMARS, a few more Abrams tanks, a few more F-16s, Ukraine will magically turn the tide. But the numbers don't lie. Russia has mobilized over 300,000 troops. Its defense industry is running at full capacity, producing artillery shells at a rate the West can't match. And its economy, despite sanctions, has proven far more resilient than anyone predicted. Meanwhile, Ukraine is running out of men. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now over 40, and the country's population has been devastated by emigration and casualties. The idea that Ukraine can win a conventional war against Russia is a fantasy, and the longer we pretend otherwise, the more lives will be lost in pursuit of an unattainable goal. This brings me to the most dangerous part of the blobs: the idea that diplomacy is weakness. In reality, diplomacy is the only thing that can prevent this war from spiraling into something far worse. The Minsk agreements, flawed as they were, offered a path to de-escalation. They were sabotaged by both sides, but primarily by Ukraine, which refused to implement the political reforms required to reintegrate Donbass. Now, we're in a situation where the only way to end the fighting is through a negotiated settlement, but neither side is willing to make the necessary concessions. Russia won't withdraw from the territories it's annexed, and Ukraine won't accept anything less than a full restoration of its 1991 borders. The result? A war of attrition that benefits no one except the arms manufacturers and the ideologues who profit from endless conflict. Let me be, I'm not saying Russia is blameless. Far from it. Putin's invasion was a reckless gamble, and the atrocities committed by Russian forces are indefensible. But war is not a morality play. It's a brutal, messy business where the laws of power ultimately prevail. And the hard truth is that the US and its allies have no realistic path to victory in Ukraine. The best we can hope for is a frozen conflict, where the fighting stops but the underlying tensions remain. The worst-case scenario is a direct NATO-Russia war, which would make the Cuban Missile Crisis look like a minor skirmish. So what's the way out? First, we need to stop pretending that this war is about democracy versus autocracy. It's not. It's about power, and the sooner we accept that, the sooner we can start talking about real solutions. Second, we need to pressure Ukraine to negotiate. That doesn't mean abandoning them, it means telling them that the West cannot and will not fight this war for them. Third, we need to engage with Russia, not as a pariah, but as a major power with legitimate interests. That means recognizing that NATO action has limits, and that Ukraine's neutrality is the only viable long-term solution. This won't be easy. The blob will resist every step of the way. The media will call it surrender. The hawks will accuse us of betrayal. But here's the alternative is far worse. A world where the US and Russia are locked in a permanent state of low-intensity conflict, where Europe is economically devastated, and where the risk of nuclear war is higher than it's been in decades. That's not a future anyone should want. I've spent my life studying war. I've seen what happens when nations refuse to face reality. And I can tell you the longer we wait to change course, the harder it will be to avoid catastrophe. The time for illusions is over. The time for diplomacy is now. Before it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. The war there is a symptom of a much larger geopolitical realignment, one that's been building for decades but has now reached a breaking point. The post-Cold War order, the one where the US could dictate terms to the world with impunity, is collapsing. And the sooner we accept that, the less painful the transition will be. Let me explain why this matters. For 30 years, Washington has operated under the assumption that NATO action was cost-free, that Russia could be endlessly contained, and that China would eventually liberalize if we just waited long enough. That was always a fantasy. The 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, where the alliance declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join, was the moment the die was cast. Putin warned then that this was a direct threat to Russia's security. He wasn't bluffing. Neither was he when he annexed Crimea in 2014 after the US-backed coup in Kiev. And he certainly wasn't bluffing when he launched the full-scale invasion in 2022. Here's the uncomfortable: Russia has always seen Ukraine as existential. Not because of some imperial nostalgia, but because of geography. The North European plain, the vast, flat corridor that stretches from France to the Urals, has been the invasion route of choice for every major power that's ever tried to conquer Russia: Napoleon in 1812, the Kaiser in 1914, Hitler in 1941. Ukraine sits squarely in the middle of that plain. For Moscow, a hostile Ukraine in NATO isn't just a strategic inconvenience, it's an existential threat. And no amount of moralizing about sovereignty or democracy changes that basic military reality. Now, the establishment will tell you that Putin is a madman, that he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union, that he's bent on world domination. But if you look at what he's actually done, not what he said, but what he's done, it's far more limited. Crimea was a response to the 2014 coup. The Donbass intervention was a response to Kiev's refusal to implement the Minsk agreements. The 2022 invasion was a response to 8 years of shelling in the Donbass and the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. None of this justifies the invasion, but it does explain it. And if we're going to find a way out of this mess, we need to understand the other side's red lines, not just our own. The problem is that the US foreign policy establishment has spent the last 2 decades doing the opposite. We've treated diplomacy as a reward for good behavior rather than a tool for managing conflict. We've exited NATO right up to Russia's borders while dismissing Moscow's concerns as irrelevant. We've backed coups in Ukraine, Georgia, and elsewhere, assuming that Russia would just take it. And now we're shocked that Putin has pushed back. Let me be, I'm not defending Putin. I'm saying that if you want to avoid war, you have to understand the other side's perspective. And right now, the US doesn't. We're still operating under the delusion that we can force Russia to accept our terms, that sanctions will break the Russian economy, that Ukraine can win a total victory. None of that is true. The Russian economy has adapted. The sanctions have backfired, strengthening Putin's grip on power and pushing countries like India, China, and even Turkey into Moscow's orbit. And Ukraine? No matter how much money and weapons we pour in, they cannot defeat Russia militarily. Not without a direct NATO intervention, which would mean World War III. Now, the military implications of this are stark. The US and NATO are not prepared for a prolonged conflict with Russia. Our defense industrial base is a shadow of what it was during the Cold War. Our stockpiles of critical munitions, artillery shells, air defense missiles, anti-tank weapons are depleted. And our allies in Europe? They're even worse off. Germany, once the backbone of NATO's conventional deterrence, has hollowed out its military to the point where it couldn't fight a war with Russia for more than a few weeks. France is better off, but not by much. And the Eastern Europeans? They're terrified, but they don't have the manpower or the industrial capacity to hold the line without massive US support. Here's the Russia is in a far stronger position than most people realize. Their military has adapted to the realities of modern warfare. They've learned from their early mistakes in 2022 and have adjusted their tactics. They're grinding down Ukrainian forces with superior artillery, drones, and electronic warfare. And they're doing it while mobilizing their economy for a long war. Meanwhile, the West is still pretending that this is a short-term crisis that can be solved with more weapons and more sanctions. The longer this goes on, the worse it gets. Every month that passes, the risk of escalation increases. A Ukrainian collapse could trigger a Russian push into NATO territory, either by accident or design. A miscalculation, say, a NATO aircraft accidentally striking Russian forces, could spiral into a direct conflict. And let's not forget the nuclear dimension. Russia has made it clear that any direct NATO intervention would cross a red line. Are we really willing to risk nuclear war over a country that isn't even a NATO member? Now, I know what the Hawks will if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he'll keep going. Next it'll be Poland, then the Baltics. That's nonsense. Russia doesn't have the manpower or the economic strength to conquer Europe. What they want is a buffer zone, a neutral Ukraine that can't be used as a staging ground for NATO. And frankly, that's a reasonable demand. The alternative is a forever war that drains our resources, weakens our position against China, and risks a catastrophic escalation. The real threat isn't Russia. It's China. And the longer we're bogged down in Ukraine, the more time Beijing has to prepare for the inevitable confrontation over Taiwan. The Pentagon's own reports make this China is rapidly exiting its military, modernizing its nuclear arsenal, and building the capabilities to project power far beyond its shores. Meanwhile, we're spending billions on a war in Europe that we can't win, while our Pacific allies watch nervously. Here's the bottom: the US cannot afford to fight two major wars at once. We don't have the industrial capacity, the manpower, or the political will. And yet, that's exactly where we're headed if we don't change course. The war in Ukraine is a distraction from the real managing the rise of China without triggering a catastrophic conflict. And the longer we pretend that we can have it all, victory in Ukraine, containment of Russia, and dominance in the Pacific, the closer we come to disaster. So what's the solution? It's the same one I've been arguing: diplomacy. We need to push Ukraine to the negotiating table, not with ultimatums, but with the understanding that the alternative is annihilation. We need to offer Russia a face-saving off-ramp, one that acknowledges their security concerns without rewarding aggression. And we need to start treating China as the peer competitor they are, not as a problem to be contained, but as a power that must be engaged. This won't be popular. The blob will scream betrayal. The media will call it appeasement. But here's the alternative is far worse. A world where the US is stretched thin, where our allies are divided, and where the risk of nuclear war is higher than it's been in decades. That's not a world anyone should want. I've spent my life studying war. I've seen what happens when nations refuse to face reality. And I can tell you, the longer we wait to change course, the harder it will be to avoid catastrophe. The time for illusions is over. The time for hard choices is now. Before it's too late.